I have to admit that this film in the series I was a little wary of. Watching and reviewing this one. Not because it's bad, but because I don't have a lot of memories of it. I know I've watched it a couple times. But kind of like Little Giant, when I come home and I'm in the mood for an Abbott and Costello film, this is not one of the ones I reach for. And I remember watching it as a kid, and I liked it as a kid, but it didn't hit me as much as like Whodunit, or Hold That Ghost, or Hit the Ice, or Time of Their Lives, or the Buck Privates films. You know, it was just one that I watched. I thought, okay, that was fine, and I didn't really go back to it that often. I've like I say, I've watched it a couple times here and there, but it's not one that I regularly view like I have some of these others. And I was a little concerned about that because, kind of like I was concerned when I was watching Little Giant, I think is the reason for that because I don't actually like it. Because we are going to be getting into the point. I'm sorry to say this. I really am sorry to say this. But I've hinted at it enough. We're going to be getting to the point in their careers in a couple movies where the films start to take a downward slide. That's just natural. And I couldn't remember, because again, this is the first time I've tried to watch these chronologically. I couldn't remember if this was one of the later films or what, and going, okay, I mean, what am I in for? Sorry, I just noticed that the movie theater I go to is going to be reopening soon, so I'm happy about that. Sorry, anyway, off topic. So I sat down to watch it, not quite sure what I was going to get, and I have to say, pleasantly surprised that I actually really enjoyed this one. More so than I clearly did as a kid. I remember like the first 10, 15 minutes of it, and then everything after that is kind of a blur. And watching it through, I really enjoyed it. And so it's a delightful treat. Just goes to show that even when you're very familiar with a series of films, or you're familiar with an entire series, they can still surprise you sometimes when you go back later and watch them with a more critical eye. So I'm very happy to say that. So here we go. The Wistful Widow of Wagon Gap, a delightful surprise in the Abbott and Costello filmography. If you remember all the way back when I talked about Ride 'em Cowboy, which I said was one of their first not-so-good pictures, one of the things I mentioned about that film is I didn't understand why they just didn't do a proper Western. Why it was this modern dude ranch mixed with, you know, cattle rustlers and crap that none of it came together and made sense. Is why didn't they just put Bud and Lou in a real Western? And here, many years later, they actually do. So this is a proper Western taking place in the Old West, which makes sense. And it's kind of weird that it took them this long to do it when you consider Westerns were among the most popular films at that time. Westerns were big money. So it's bizarre that it took them this long to get Bud and Lou into a proper Western, but it's well worth the wait. So what's this one about? Well, in this one, Bud and Lou play two salesmen who are on their way to California, and they stop over in a little Montana town called Wagon Gap, which is just this lawless western town where a small group of citizens are trying to get law and order established in it, but the majority of the citizens are just happy drinking. The elected official, like the judge, is just enjoying being corrupt, and they're having a hell of a time. Well, Bud and Lou were in town about 5 minutes when Lou is wrongfully accused of killing a man in a gunfight. So to prevent them from being hung, this citizens committee that's trying to establish law and order basically find this loophole in Montana law that says if you kill a man in a gunfight, the person who wins is now financially responsible for paying off all of the deceased debts and taking care of the family. So Lou now is responsible for taking care of this man's children and his widow, the title character, the Wistful Widow of Wagon Gap, played by the wonderful Marjorie Main. And the widow is just this shrewish, domineering harpy of a woman who just browbeats poor Lou endlessly. She is just a hellcat, and everybody in the town is afraid of her. So for the majority of the film, for about to the middle of the picture, it's just watching poor Lou just be bullied by this woman, like, relentlessly. Again, and it's especially harsh when you realize he didn't do it. So he's being punished for something he didn't do, and he's just being ground under. But the film suddenly takes a sharp turn. Like, if they had just done that for the entire plot, you could have had a fairly decent film out of it. But the film takes a really sharp turn in the middle when a bar fight breaks out and a man threatens to shoot Lou, and he says, "Go ahead, shoot me, because then you got to take care of this." And the guy immediately backs off, saying, "Oh no, I don't want any of that." And it suddenly dawns on Lou and the Citizens Committee that nobody in this town is going to be willing to shoot him, because if they do, they have to be responsible for the widow, and nobody wants that. So now nobody in this rootin' tootin' town is willing to get in a fight with Lou Costello. And they make him the sheriff, and he brings law and order to the town. One thing I have to say, and I don't know if I've mentioned this in previous reviews, but something I'm finding interesting as I'm rewatching these movies, they're standard length for the time, about an hour and a half. Shorter ones are maybe an hour and 15, 20 minutes, somewhere in there. Standard for the time, especially for B pictures. 2-hour, 3-hour movies were not the norm back then, and when they were the big films, the Gone with the Winds or the Ben-Hurs, the ones that the studio was really pouring a lot of money into. So the typical length of a film is about an hour and a half, give or take. But what's kind of striking me is I always felt when I was a kid that these films were a lot longer. And it's not because they drag or they have a pacing problem or anything. It's because a lot happens in them. The plots, as I'm sure you've noticed as you've watched me try to recount these stories during the course of these reviews, these stories are very convoluted, and they take twists and turns and go all over the place. And because of that, you would tend to think these movies were a lot longer than they actually are, because nothing ever feels really rushed in them. There's very few times when you feel like a story plot or a storyline or a plot point, let's get the terminology correct, is rushed or doesn't connect very well. And when that does happen, it's something like Ride 'em Cowboy, where none of the story points match up. So it's just kind of interesting to me that a lot happens in this movie, but it happens within a relatively short span of time. So anyway, so as I mentioned, I really ended up enjoying this movie a lot more than I remember. It felt much fresher to me. And I think that's the key word. It's fresh. They feel like the last couple movies, this one and Buck Privates Come Home, and we'll see it a little bit later down the line, that they finally kind of hit a sweet spot between the old school Abbott and Costello formula, routine, and a very loose plot linking it all together, very commedia dell'arte, and the newer formula that they were experimenting with Little Giant and Time of Their Lives, where it's more story driven and the comedy comes out of their reaction to the story. And it feels like they finally kind of hit the right balance with these last two films. They do a couple of their routines, but they're not the center point of the movie. They're there when it makes sense and when it actually makes a funny scene. I think they only do one of their classic scenes in this one. It's They did a version of it in Here Come the Co-Eds, where Lou orders soup and there's a clam in it and the clam's making noise, and he's trying to tell Bud there's a clam in the soup, and he's like, "No, there's not, eat the soup," and the clam's spitting at him and all of this. They do a version of that here where one of the bratty kids puts a frog in Lou's soup. This is not one of my favorite Abbott and Costello routines, but this one actually makes it feel really fresh and really funny. This is the best they've ever done this one as far as I'm concerned. And the rest of the film is just them reacting to the situation. A big shout out has to go to their co-star in this one, Marjorie Main, who really brings a fun energy and flavor and new chemistry to this established team. And Marjorie Main is a long established, steady hand character actor. She was one of the best character actors of her day. She was put in this one. Basically, this film got made, apparently. The producers agreed to it because they were going to have Marjorie Main in it, who had just done a really big hit for the studio called The Egg and I, where she plays Ma Kettle. And that film was such a huge success that it led to the very successful strain of Ma and Pa Kettle films. Classic film lovers, especially holiday films, will most likely remember her the most as the maid in the Judy Garland classic Meet Me in St. Louis. She plays Katie the maid. She was also in the Judy Garland film The Harvey Girls. So Marjorie Main is a steady hand at character acting. Moreover, she is just a brilliant presence. She's kind of like Margaret Dumont in the Marx Brothers movies, only not as demure. She is a loud, powerful screen presence, and she has a barking voice. You know, when she barks, it is loud and commanding. Like, I could freaking understand why you'd be intimidated by this woman. And putting her in there against little Lou Costello, and, you know, of course, he has a very demanding presence as well, but it's in a much different way, a much subtler way. It creates a very, very interesting chemistry, and they work very well with each other. She's a fun character. At times a little too mean, because like I said, you really do feel sorry for Lou Costello when he's just being browbeaten by this woman. But that's her job. She's doing her job. So it's a fun person. This is not something we get to see a lot. We're going to see it a little bit more in the later part of their careers. But again, you don't really see Abbott and Costello opposite other great actors of their time. That was something they actually had a lot of problems with. They wanted better co-stars. You know, they had kind of this revolving door of day players and steady character actors, but no big names. You know, Marjorie Main and Dick Powell are kind of the big ones that they've worked with so far. You know, and they always kind of felt a little resentful about that. Like they weren't good enough for the bigger name stars to come and do their pictures, which, you know, unfortunately is kind of true of the time. You know, big name stars, the A-listers, did not go and do comedies with the comedy acts. That's just not the way. You know, people forget that. You know, we forget that living in the age of the Avengers and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that back in the day, respected actors would never lower themselves to science fiction or horror or comedies. They wouldn't do that. If they do it, they would do screwball comedies like that god-awful Bringing Up Baby. But anywho, I'm off track. But yeah, the whole feel of this film just feels fresh and a little sharper. Like I say, I remember the first 10 minutes of this film pretty well, but even I was laughing really hard at some of Lou's one-liners and zingers. They're not as cuddly as they usually are. They're a little bit sharper, like they would be on the radio. I mentioned this before on these reviews too. If you listen to the radio show versus the movies, the Lou Costello character is very different. The movies, he's always this, you know, again, he's this little kid. He's this little boy in a man's body. The radio show, he's a lot meaner and a little bit more vindictive. And his insults are a lot crueler. And that's kind of the Lou Costello we're seeing here. He's not a bad character. He's not a mean character. But his dialogue is a little sharper, and his takedowns a little less cuddly than they used to be. And I think that's good. It works very well. Whoever was writing their dialogue for this one really did a good job, and they did a great job playing off of it. So the Wistful Widow, I don't know quite what else to say about this one. I guess the only other really notable performance in this one is the judge, who had previously played Lou's uncle in Little Giant. He's this corrupt judge who's, you know, doesn't care about justice. He's just corrupt. So he's a fun little character. Never gets his comeuppance. That's always a bit depressing. But it's a fun movie. Highlights of this one, Just include when Lou becomes the sheriff and nobody wants to mess with him, and he goes from being this bullied character to almost being a bully himself and making the whole town basically kneel down to him. There's also the climactic fight scene where Marjorie Main and Lou Costello lead all of the women of the town basically to go beat up the bad guys because they're tired of all the gunplay shenanigans. So it's actually fairly progressive. I don't know if that's the right word, but, you know, all the women just basically going, we're done. We're not going to let these men do these gunfights. We're going to go beat the shit out of these bandits. And the end fight scene is very fun and very fast-paced. A lot of action going on. You can only imagine what it must have taken to choreograph this film. So there's just a lot of good in this movie, and I found that I enjoyed it a lot. Looking at the behind-the-scenes history of this film, a lot was going on backstage too. Lou Costello, during the course of this film, suffered another personal tragedy. This time he lost his father, Sebastian. Just prior to the start of filming, his father died, and he actually, you know, he blamed his manager for it, because his manager had called his father the previous night right before he passed away and was, you know, trying to, you know, get him to help the manager talk Lou into something, and Lou thought that the guy upset his father so much that it killed him, and he fired his manager over it. You forget sometimes that Lou Costello, lovable, big-hearted guy, he was Italian, and he was old school Italian. When you crossed him, or he felt you crossed him, you know, you were out. That was it. And, you know, very Frank Sinatra. People know Frank Sinatra did that a lot, but Lou Costello did it too. That's Italian, you know. That's the Pazan way. But anyway, so this is a very difficult thing for him. There's this lovely story where the day of the funeral, they're doing one of the saloon scenes, and Lou comes in, and he hasn't been on set all day, and everybody just goes quiet, you know, kind of out of respect. And Lou very somberly kind of walks on stage, and he kind of takes his place, and he goes up to this guy who they say that Universal hired this gentleman to literally be backstage with Abbott and Costello and keep them amused while they're filming. That was literally this guy's job. And this guy is on set, you know, helping get prepared, and Lou just walks up to him, this very somber face, and just spits a mouthful of water at him, and the entire set erupts in laughter. And after that, the film was kind of able to resume in the right spirit. So I just found that a very sweet story. And the last thing, kind of touching on Lou's father, as a tribute to him, who was not only very close to Lou, but was also a lifelong fan of Westerns. Lou had his name added to the producer credits. So Sebastian Costello is credited as a producer on this film. Two other little interesting facts before we wrap this one up. Apparently, this film is based on an actual law that was on the books in Montana, and I don't know if it still is, but apparently it was an actual law that if you kill a man in a gunfight, you become financially responsible for all of his debts and to take care of his family. So I don't know. I wonder how successful that actually was at you know, limiting gunfights and whatnot. That's actually something I'd be very curious to know. Also, apparently, the original treatment for the script, the original idea for the script, was apparently supposed to be a Jimmy Stewart vehicle, which obviously not to this level of ridiculousness. But the idea of somebody being accused of killing a man in a gunfight and having to take care of the widow was originally supposed to be a Jimmy Stewart film. I would imagine it'd probably be more of a love story, kind of a rom-com of its day kind of thing, because Jimmy Stewart was good in those. He was great in Westerns. So, I don't know. I don't know what that would have looked like, but I'm very curious what the Jimmy Stewart version of this film would have been. So yeah, this was a delightful surprise for me. I didn't think I was going to enjoy this film as much as I did, and it's, again, a wonderful thing of going back and looking at things with more experience and a different eye than you may have viewed them originally. Sometimes you find that you enjoy things a little bit more, you appreciate them a little bit more, and that's definitely true of The Wistful Widow of Wagon Gap. So when next we meet, Bud and Lou are going to go back to their roots a bit. We've been doing these different types of movies, different formula, but for the next film, they're going to go back and rely on their old formula of routine, reliable comedy to kind of move a very loose story along. And I think it's going to pay off fairly well. But we'll see what you think when next we meet and we discuss The Noose Hangs High. So thank you for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I'll see you at the movies.